The 1960s was the decade of the Civil Rights Movement and the controversial Vietnam War.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
On August 26, 1968, after the first American troops set foot in Vietnam, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago. Social unrest throughout the nation that year made Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley and the convention leaders nervous that protests would be violent. To help Chicago police keep order, Daley called in National Guard and Army troops before the convention began. The Youth International Party, known as the Yippies, were against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. They saw the convention as an opportunity to promote anti-war sentiment. They published threats that nails would be placed to block roads, the convention center would be stormed, and LSD would be dumped into the city's water supply. The Yippies did not act upon their threats, and the protests actually began quite peacefully. However, the troops were expecting violence, and they managed the protests aggressively. Tensions escalated and riots broke out, resulting in a publicized national spectacle that may have even changed the outcome of the presidential election. The year of 1968 had already been violent, with 2 assassinations before the convention in August. Martin Luther King, the civil rights activist, was shot on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee, approximately 5 months before the convention. Robert F. Kennedy, a popular Democratic presidential candidate, was shot on June 4th in Los Angeles after winning the California primary, 2 months prior to the convention. Chicago leaders were afraid that these assassinations increased the likelihood of violence during the convention. 1968 also brought 2 key moments in the Vietnam War that angered United States citizens. U.S. troops landed in Vietnam 2 years before. The Tet Offensive was many surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese troops and the Viet Cong on countless cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. After this news, many Americans realized the U.S. military position in Vietnam was not as strong as they thought. In the My Lai massacre, American soldiers killed the majority of the population of the South Vietnamese hamlet My Lai because they thought the Viet Cong were hiding amongst the South Vietnamese. Americans were astonished that civilians were killed by U.S. soldiers. Many lost faith in the war effort. The Tet Offensive and My Lai massacre brought a massive turning point in public opinion of the Vietnam War, which raised the stakes in the upcoming presidential elections. Given the tumultuous year and the threats made by the Yippies, Mayor Daley was expecting violence. He used his considerable political power to call in the Illinois Army National Guard and the 1st Armored Division and 5th Infantry Division of the United States Army before the convention began, hoping to keep his repeated promise that he would maintain order during the protests. They set up security checkpoints, blockades, and barbed wire all over Chicago, especially around the International Amphitheater where the convention was held. The protesters, including the Yippies, actually began their rallies around major hotels near Michigan Avenue, such as the Hilton, Palmer, and Conrad Hotel. Seeing the high security and the extensive defensive preparation, protesters were angry and offended that the government perceived them as such an extreme threat. Later, Jerry Rubin, a leader of the Youth International Party, accused the city of unnecessarily escalating the tensions during the protests and inciting the violence that ended up taking place. On Thursday, August 22nd, a few days before the convention began, the first incident of violence occurred over a curfew violation. On Friday the 23rd, planned protests began, but the city had denied most application forms, leaving protesters no legal options to gather peacefully and express their opinions on the Vietnam War. Each day that passed brought more frustrations to both sides. Law enforcement waited in public spaces such as street corners and were unnecessarily aggressive trying to clear streets or block intersections. When protest leaders saw this, they told people to retaliate. Video cameras captured the 5th Infantry Division, Chicago Police, and National Guard pushing through crowds and beating protesters with billy clubs unprovoked. The 1st Armored Division threw tear gas and smoke bombs into the crowd and drove into the protesters with military jeeps laden with barbed wire on the front of the vehicles. The most publicized riot took place outside the Conrad Hotel and involved 15,000 protesters. The entire nation was watching. The riots ended on August 29th, 8 days after the first violent incident took place. Reports claimed 11 deaths, 500 injuries, and more than 2,150 arrests. In the aftermath, both the protesters and law enforcement blamed each other. In September, a federal commission began an investigation, and in December, they submitted the Walker Report to the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. This report described the violence as a police riot, placing the blame mainly on law enforcement for using excessive force. It acknowledged the protesters' profanity and provocation of police, but blamed the city government for not giving permits, which would have given protesters legal options. Ultimately, the protesters as a whole were unarmed and protected by the right to free speech and the right to assemble. The Walker Report is the first use of the phrase police riot in United States history, and law enforcement nationwide continues to consider better ways to handle potential riots.
Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going